The sky was still dark when Thomas Hale stepped onto the porch of his ranch. The air was cool, the kind of chill that whispered of an oncoming storm, even though the horizon was clear. He pulled his worn hat low over his brow and looked toward the pasture, where the last of his horses grazed in the pale blue light before dawn. There had once been hundreds. Now there was just one. A stallion named Dustfire, chestnut coat glinting like old copper, mane streaked with silver. The horse had been born on this land, raised by Thomas's hands, and was the last living reminder of his family's legacy. Thomas rubbed his hands together, rough and cracked from years of work. He was 52, and though his frame was still solid, there was wear in the way he moved. The drought had burned the grass, the markets had dried up, and his ranch hands had long gone to find work in towns where the trains still came. For months, he had lived mostly in silence, his only company the wind and the ghosts of memory. He didn't expect anyone that morning. But fate has a way of arriving quietly. As the first gold streaks touched the sky, two figures appeared at the edge of his land, small, hesitant, and barefoot. They were Apache girls, no older than 12 or 13, their long dark braids swinging as they hurried toward him. One carried a blanket bundle, the other had a look of pure fear in her eyes. Thomas straightened, his heart tightening. He had lived near the reservation for years and knew the unspoken tension that lingered between the white settlers and the Apache people. They rarely came near his land unless it was serious. The older girl stopped a few yards away, clutching her sister's hand. "Please," she said softly. "Our father, he's hurt. The soldiers came through the night. We need help." Thomas hesitated only a moment before stepping forward. "How far?" he asked. 2 miles, she said, voice trembling. By the river bend. He could see the fear beneath her brave tone, the kind of fear that came when a child carried the weight of something far too heavy. He nodded and motioned toward the barn. "I'll saddle up." Inside the barn, the smell of hay and old leather greeted him like an old friend. He ran his hand along Dustfire's neck. The stallion turned, snorted softly, and pressed his head against Thomas's chest. "One more ride, boy," Thomas whispered. "Maybe the last." Minutes later, he rode out with the girls walking beside him, their pace quick and desperate. The rising sun bled orange over the horizon, bathing the land in light that looked almost holy. Thomas had seen hundreds of sunrises, but that one felt different, like the beginning of something that would change everything. When they reached the river bend, he saw the man lying half covered in reeds. He was older, his body wrapped in bloodied cloth, his chest rising shallowly. The man's face was proud and weathered, an Apache chief by the look of his ceremonial necklace. His eyes flickered open as Thomas knelt beside him. "You came," the man rasped. "I did," Thomas replied. "Let's get you to shade." It took both girls and Thomas's strength to lift the man, but they managed to place him gently against a tree. Thomas tore strips from his shirt to tighten the bandages, then fetched water from his canteen. He didn't speak much, words weren't what the moment needed. Compassion spoke louder. The chief's gaze followed every movement, his expression unreadable. Finally, he whispered, "You are not afraid." Thomas shook his head. "Of dying, I've been close enough before. Of helping, no, sir." The chief's lips curved faintly. "My name is Nanton. My daughters, Nia and Tala." Thomas nodded. "I'm Thomas Hale. This land used to be called Hale Ranch." Nanton looked around. "Used to." Thomas exhaled. "Drought took it. Debt took the rest." There was silence then, broken only by the trickle of the river. Thomas worked until the bleeding slowed and Nanton's breathing eased. When he finally sat back, exhaustion weighed on him, but the gratitude in the girl's eyes was worth every drop of sweat. "Thank you," Nia whispered. "You saved our father." Thomas shook his head. "I just did what anyone should do." But deep down, he knew not everyone would have. He stayed with them until noon, then helped build a small fire and shared what food he had left, a single loaf of bread and dried meat. When Nanton tried to offer him a carved pendant in return, Thomas refused. "Keep it," he said gently. "A man shouldn't charge for kindness." When the sun began to fall westward, Thomas stood to leave. "You'll need a horse," he said, glancing at Dustfire. "He's strong. He'll get you home before dark." Nia's eyes widened. "You'd give him to us?" Thomas smiled faintly. "He's all I've got left. But seems to me you need him more." Nanton's hand trembled as he reached for Thomas's arm. "You would give your last horse to strangers?" Thomas looked toward the horizon. "You're not strangers. You're people trying to save what's left of your family. I know how that feels." There was a moment, a long, quiet moment, where the air between them carried more than words. Then Nanton nodded, his eyes glistening. At sunrise, you gave life. I will not forget. Thomas turned and began the walk back home on foot, the dust rising behind him as the sound of hooves faded away. The sky deepened into orange, then crimson. He reached his porch just as the first stars began to appear. He sat down heavily, his boots caked with dirt, his heart strangely light. For the first time in years, he felt peace. But peace can be deceptive, like the calm before a storm. By the time dusk painted the valley purple, the ground began to tremble. Thomas looked up, confused at first, then alarmed. From the far ridge, a line of riders appeared, dozens, then scores, moving in formation. The sun was setting behind them, silhouettes against firelight skies. 200 Apache warriors, their feathers and spears glinting like a tide of bronze. Thomas's breath caught. He stepped off the porch, unsure whether to run or stand his ground. He'd helped their chief, yes, but an army that size could flatten his ranch in minutes. He squared his shoulders anyway. If this was the price, he'd face it. The riders slowed as they approached. Dust swirled around them, the sound of hooves rolling like thunder. At their head rode Nanton, upright in his saddle, bandaged but alive. Beside him were Nia and Tala on Dustfire, the horse's mane shimmering in the twilight. The chief raised a hand, and the army halted as one. Thomas's heart pounded. The chief dismounted slowly, wincing from his wounds, and walked toward him. Behind him, the 200 warriors waited in silence. Nanton stopped a few feet away and bowed his head. At sunrise, you gave your last horse, he said, voice carrying across the quiet field. At dusk, I bring you what cannot be measured. Thomas swallowed hard. You didn't owe me anything. The chief's eyes softened. Honor is not debt, it is remembrance. He turned and gave a short signal. The warriors moved, swift and organized. They dismounted, forming a half-circle around Thomas's ranch. Then, to his astonishment, they began unloading sacks of grain, bundles of hides, tools, and food. Some led cattle, others carried water barrels. Within minutes, his empty land became alive again, filled with the hum of people rebuilding what had been lost. Thomas stood frozen. What is this? Nanton smiled faintly. A gift returned. The army you see does not come to fight. They come to build. Tala ran up to him, her small hands gripping his rough palm. You gave us hope, she said softly. Now we give it back. Thomas blinked rapidly, his throat tightening. He hadn't cried since his wife died years ago, but in that moment, he felt tears burn behind his eyes. He watched as the Apache men repaired his fences, as women unpacked food, as children carried water. His barren ranch began to breathe again. As the stars emerged fully, the chief joined him on the porch. For many winters, Nanton said, our people were taught to distrust yours. But today, one man changed that. You gave what you could not spare. That kind of gift changes more than one life, it changes generations. Thomas looked out over the field, where Apache and settler labored side by side, laughter mixing with the sound of hammering wood. I just did what was right, he murmured. Nanton smiled. Sometimes, doing what is right is the rarest courage of all. They sat in silence for a while, watching the moon rise. The land glowed silver, soft and calm. The same ground that once divided them now united them in purpose. Thomas realized then that the ranch he thought was lost had become something greater, not a place of profit, but a sanctuary of grace. Days turned to weeks. The Apache stayed, helping rebuild fences, dig wells, and plant new crops. In return, Thomas shared his skills, teaching them how to work the plow, how to mend saddles, how to trade in nearby towns. The distrust that had lingered for decades began to fade. The children played together. The old men shared stories. The land itself seemed to breathe easier. One evening, Thomas found Nia and Tala sitting by the corral, feeding Dustfire apples. The horse had become theirs, but they let Thomas visit often. He misses you, Tala said with a smile. Thomas chuckled. I miss him too, but he's where he belongs. Nia looked up at him, eyes shining. My father says you're like the sunrise. You gave light when there was only night. He didn't know what to say to that. He just nodded, quietly humbled. When the harvest finally came that autumn, the fields were golden again. Thomas stood beside Nanton, overlooking what they had created together. Seems the land remembers kindness, he said softly. Nanton nodded. Kindness is the only thing the earth never forgets. The ranch thrived once more, but it was no longer just Hale Ranch, it was a shared place, a symbol of unity. Travelers passing through often stopped, puzzled by the sight of an old white rancher working side by side with Apache families. Some whispered, some mocked, but most simply watched in wonder. In a world that had long been divided, something rare had taken root. Years later, when Thomas grew too old to work the fields, the Apache built him a small house near the river. They called it, the House of the Sunrise. Children would bring him food, and every morning he'd sit on the porch, watching the dawn light spread across the valley, remembering the day two frightened girls had knocked on his door and changed his life forever. When Thomas passed away one winter morning, they buried him beneath an oak tree overlooking the ranch. Nanton, now graying and bent, led the ceremony. He was not one of us by blood, he said, voice heavy with emotion, but he became one by heart. At dusk that day, 200 Apache warriors rode again, not to fight, but to honor. They circled the ranch in silence, their torches glowing like stars fallen to earth. And in the fading light, Dustfire stood tall beside the grave, mane rippling, eyes fixed on the horizon, as if waiting for his master to ride once more. And perhaps, somewhere beyond that horizon, Thomas Hale did. For the land remembers kindness. And sometimes, a gift given at sunrise can echo forever into the dusk.